Take off, it's true. Right there on our flag. It's right there when you look at it and you see past that sacred maple leaf. You know what you see? You see that in America, you may be red, white, and blue. But in Canada, you're red, white, but never blue, eh? Ever.
Hello everyone. Today I'm going to talk about how I made my transition from the United States up to Canada as a visual effects employee and what kind of steps I went through in case you have any interest in coming up here to Canada. Let's talk about it. Hey everyone, Cup of Joe's going strong, but it could use your support. So please like this video or make sure you're subscribed. And the more you do that, it'll put it in other people's feeds and it'll get the word out there. I appreciate it. And hey, don't forget, October's not quite over yet, so you can still get in on the contest for the giveaway, the link above. And it's the cool, exclusive Pixar walking teapot toy. Check it out. You can't buy it in stores. Hey, at the end of this video, I'm going to give you some tips that I definitely want you to keep in mind if you're thinking of coming across the border. So make sure you stay tuned for those.
You got your can of do's and you got your can of don'ts.
Okay, so I arrived in Canada in 2013 and I became a citizen in 2021. So I want to talk about what that journey was and how I got here and what the steps were. Let's go over it now. In 2012, I was in Florida at Digital Main's Florida studio. It imploded spectacularly, I guess you'd say. No fault to the current people running DD. It's a new crop of management nowadays. But back then, it was almost running to the ground, right? It went bankrupt. My wife and I were able to escape fairly unscathed. Now, just a few days after the bankruptcy was announced, a wonderful producer friend out in Florida connected me to a studio up here, Image Engine. And they were interested in whether or not I was willing to come up here to manage the technical assistants or the render wranglers up here in Canada. Now, I was just trying to figure out how I was going to deal with getting out of Florida, so I wasn't really ready to talk about moving out of the country yet. But needless to say, they planted the seed. We went back to Los Angeles. We're looking for work. It was very difficult for me to find work because as a render manager, there's only so many shops that have maybe one person who does that role. That one person's only at one of the locations. They're multinational places. So I just had a tough time finding a role. My wife, being a production person, she was finding production manager, production coordinator roles all over the place. But it was a little tough for me. So around Christmas time, we decided to put the call into Image Engine and say, let's talk. And by March, I was getting a job offer to come up there. And we were ready to pack it up and move across the border to go to Vancouver, never having been to the city before. Now, we have been to Seattle, and we lived there for 6 months or so. So I was familiar with the Northwest in general, and some of our best friends were Canadians, and some of the sweetest people we knew were Canadians. So we thought, well, how bad can it be? We're just going for a year. So we decided to put everything in the storage. We put our car in the storage, and we put our RV in the storage, and we pretty much put whatever we could fit on our pickup truck, like the Beverly Hillbillies, and just loaded it up and started driving north. Now, there's a lot of stress involved, and let me explain the biggest stress factor for us. And just a quick reminder, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a consultant, I'm just telling you about my experience. This is not advice on how you should go about doing it, but if you think you want to become a permanent resident or get a work permit or get citizenship, make sure you consult the official online documentation and a professional before you pursue that. I'm just telling you my story here. So once you have a job offer, the company is making you the job offer up in Canada has to go through a process to put together this packet, usually with some lawyers dealing with it. And they send you this packet along with your job offer. And this packet is the packet that you're going to take up to the border with you. It's not a work permit, and you don't have a work permit yet. The border officer will grant you a work permit. The border officer may not grant you a work permit. They may see some I that isn't dotted or some T that's not crossed. For whatever reason, they have complete and total power to just say no, in which case you need to turn around and head back to the States and figure out what you're going to do. This obviously had us very worried. We had put everything in the storage. We put all of our eggs in this basket. And here we are driving up to the border going, boy, I hope they let us in. So As a little backup, we had arranged for a hotel in the States for that night, just in case everything went awry. We were pretty scared about that. The whole drive up, the whole idea that we were doing all this was just a job offer and an application for a work permit, but by no means were we assured to be across the border. And we had heard of folks who didn't make it across the border for whatever reason. So we were pretty nervous. Like I said, you get this job information packet with all of the information the border guard's going to need. You have your job offer, and you take all of that up to the border. You tell them, hey, I'm coming in for a work permit. They send you over to a little side area, and you go in and you go speak to a border officer. Now, luckily, Image Engine had put together a fabulous package, so it was pretty much a 20-minute wait while they stamped some stuff and photocopied some stuff and called us back up there, and we had our work permits. So it was a pretty easy process for us going in. And there's a bonus for my wife. Whereas my work permit is tied to this company, meaning I cannot leave this company or go to any other company, or else I'm going to have to leave. That work permit only lets me work at Image Engine. But my wife, my spouse, and this also goes for domestic partners, was able to get a unrestricted permit. So other than a few specific things, I think teachers and a few other specific things that were called out, she could come up there and work in any job she wanted. So again, as a production person, she came across that border with a whole lot of opportunity in front of her where she could look at any studio. And back in 2013, they were hiring production people like mad, especially if you had experience out of the Bay Area and Hollywood like she had. So we crossed the border with my job offer in hand and her permit and my permit, and we started working, and luckily she had a job, I think, within weeks of us starting. So a little more about getting that work permit. Not anyone can get a work permit. You have to have a company sponsor you. And the job that they're applying to the government for to get your permission to come in has to be a job that they can't fill through Canadian workers. So you can imagine if they can train the person easily, such as a production assistant, well, then they consider that a job that you should be hiring Canadians for. If it's a job with very specific skills, like a render farm manager, and there's maybe 24 of us, in the industry, well, then that's a very specific role. And so I was able to come into the country as a uniquely skilled worker. And that's really important here. So you have to have unique skills. The good news is most medium and advanced level artists have those skills. Over time, of course, they've been able to build a bigger group of folks here. But the industry is growing faster than the pool. So even today, with all of the post-pandemic work up here, there's still far more work than there is people to do it, and all the studios are struggling with finding more employees. So it's still just as ripe today as it was in 2013 when we got here. Another aspect of the job that needs to be defined is, they don't really tell you this, and the studios won't tell you this, but the job has to pay well. In other words, there are certain dollar amounts that these jobs have to hit for the government to consider them worthy of coming in. So you're not allowed to pay low-paying jobs to immigrants coming in, not for this industry. So as a result, if you're basically a coordinator, a production coordinator or below, or you're a junior artist, you may not be able to get paid enough to actually qualify. So this is why I said mid artists and senior artists, producers, senior managers, these folks usually have a wage that's above that mark, but the entry level jobs or the lower level jobs may come in a little short, and for that reason alone, you can't really get a work permit here. So they'll characterize it as they're only looking for more senior roles, but really it's the dollar part that's defining this, not the role definition. So let's be clear about that. And I should point out, there are other ways to get in than the permit process that I used. The one I used brings in skilled workers for the visual effects industry, but there are some people who actually get a work permit before they even come to the country on their own. There are ones you can secure just because you have specific skills that are known to be in short supply. I mean, if you're a doctor or a surgeon, you're going to be able to apply for a work permit and come on in here because they could always use more doctors and surgeons. So I'm going to include a link to a coworker of mine named Busi who has her own YouTube channel. She came in from South Africa, and she has a different approach because she came in with a work permit, and she also talks to that in her channel. So I'll put a link in here below so you can check out her channel if you have an interest in using that method. So my permit that I got at the border that first time was a 1-year permit for a 1-year job. It was a 1-year contract at Image Engine. And within months of coming into Vancouver, it was clear we wanted to stay here forever. We fell in love with it, and I wanted to come up with a more long-term vision. Now, Image Engine was extremely good to me, and they were willing to extend even more time and started to even pursue the permit process to extend my permit at the end of that year, and bless them for doing that. But unfortunately for them, I did decide to move over to Digital Domain to run their North American render and storage operations. It just was a little better fit for me, allowed me to spread my wings a little more. And so they offered me a 2-year position. And in this case, it was just a fresh new application. It wasn't my work permit being renewed, but it was a brand new work permit. So guess what that meant? Now I have to flagpole. What's flagpoling? Well, when you get a new permit or you have to renew your permit, they make you essentially leave the country and come back in. It's a little awkward, but that's the reality of it. And it's because it's a lot easier legally to not let you into a country than it is to eject you out of a country. So most of the countries, when you're renewing your visas, they'll often make you leave and come back in. Now, for us being on the Canadian border and being U.S. citizens, it's quite easy for us to hop in the vehicle. We drive down, get some gas because it's so much cheaper in the States, and then we just turn around and drive right back in 5 minutes later. And that's what we had to do. We had to go around the flagpole with our new job offer and our new immigration packet and do the whole process again. Took the same amount of time. Digital Domains lawyers were just as good as Image Engines. And lo and behold, we got back in for a 2-year permit. So to become a permanent resident of Canada, not just a temporary worker on a worker permit, you have to be here for 2 years. It's technically 2 years and a 5-year period. So you don't have to be here consistently. It's okay if you have to leave and then come back for some more work. But once you've accrued 2 years of being here on a work permit in a 5-year period, then you can apply for permanent residency. Now, with permanent residency, it's almost like being a citizen. You don't have to leave. The only difference is you have to renew your card every 5 years, and you don't get to vote. Other than that, it's almost identical to being a Canadian citizen. So to do this, we had to get copies of all of our IDs and our passports. I had to get an FBI and criminal background check, and this has to go for any place you live for more than 6 months. So if you've lived around the world, expect to get some fingerprint checks. And if you have to get them from India and Mexico and a few other places, it can take a while and there's different processes. So this is the biggest, longest part of the process I found, was just getting the fingerprints in. And you have to take an English test. If you're from America or you're from England or any of the English-speaking countries, you'll have no problem passing this English test. It is very, very basic comprehension stuff. So you have to put all this together, and we put this all together in this big, thick paper packet. It was the most voluminous amount of paperwork I'd ever done in my life. I mean, we're talking this thick, all with the forms and the copies and the notarized and everything. We package it all up. It's around maybe October or November that year. We send it off, and we get it back. And it just says, sorry, our quota was full for the year. Try again next year. This entire packet that we'd put months into was void and null. It didn't even go through it. It broke my heart. But needless to say, we swallowed our pride, and the next year we applied again. Unfortunately, this time it was a digital online system, so we had to re-enter all that information. So needless to say, we did all that online application. We sent it into the Immigration Service, and eventually we got our COPR document, and that's our Certificate of Permanent Residency. And this says you can now go cross the border one last time and go get your PR card. So one last time, we put the dogs in the truck and we went down to the border and we got some gas and we drove around and we came back up and went back in. And this was easier than the other ones. It wasn't a work permit so much. I mean, they're used to doing PRs all the time. And so we got our 2 Canadian flags. It's the one you see behind me all the time. And we got to become permanent residents. And we were really, really emotional. It was really a long journey to get there. And that day we did everything Canadian we could. We left the border listening to Celine Dion singing "Oh Canada." We went and picked up poutine and went home. And you know, that first year we went and saw, we made sure to go hockey games and got hockey jerseys. We tried to be as Canadian as we possibly could because we absolutely love it here. But this whole time, we've been permanent residents, and the permanent residency card's going to expire, and we have to renew it, and we don't get to vote. We want to be citizens. We want to have a say. You know, we want to be part of this true north up here, and you know, being permanent residents just wasn't quite the same. So we went ahead and started our process for citizenship. We had now been there for 3 years on our permanent residency, and it's a little complicated. You can actually do it in a little less than 3. Look online, you'll see how it works. But basically, after 3 years, you can become a citizen. So this time we had to do another application. So we put together copies of all our ID and passports. Johanna took her English test because she didn't have to take it for permanent residency. She was my spouse. But now she had to take it, so she took her English test. We sent it all off, and we got our invitation to go take our history test. You have to take a Canadian history and culture test. It's kind of like the States. You got to learn all about how the government works and who the founders were, and it was really great to learn because, in fact, we didn't know a lot of the stuff until they made us take this test, and we learned all about it. And so we finally were going to go take our test, and it was canceled due to COVID. So it was going to be April of 2020 that we were going to take our test, and a month before our test, it was canceled indefinitely due to COVID. And month after month, it was just left canceled. Towards the end of the year, we started hearing that they were going to create an online test system and an online swearing ceremony and all this stuff. So basically, we had to wait. But finally, March of 2021, we got our invite to go take the test. They could do it online. It was kind of proctored via webcam. And so we were able to take our tests, and we passed our tests. We passed our tests with good high scores because we studied hard. And about a month later, we were able to do our ceremony online through a Zoom session. Of course, we couldn't do it in person. So finally, after passing the test, we quickly got our invitation to go do our online swearing-in ceremony. They used to do ceremonies in front of a judge, but because of COVID, they were doing them all via Zoom session, of course. So we took our oath and we became Canadian citizens just a couple of days before Canada Day. Shortly thereafter, we were able to participate in our first vote, and we went down there together, and it was emotional. It's always been emotional for us coming up here. We really care for Canada, and although it has its problems, and I'll be the first one to point out 10 things that are wrong with Canada. Maybe I'll do a video on that one day, but really it's a wonderful place. The people here are wonderful, and we've met some of the best people that we've ever met up here. So we're really happy to be in Canada. We're really happy Canada supports the visual effects and animation industry so strongly across all the provinces. Now, I told you I'd give you 3 tips, and these are 3 things I tell anyone I know who's thinking of coming up here to take a work permit. Tip number 1, if you are coming up here for anything close to a year or longer and you're bringing your vehicle, consider exporting your vehicle at the U.S. border, bringing it in to Canadian border, and then having it imported here over the coming months. It means you have to do some inspections and stick some French stickers in your car somewhere, but the reality is importing your car once is going to be much easier than trying to do it after you've been here for a couple of years. And exporting it from Canada is a very simple process. So I recommend, if you have any thoughts that you're going to be here for more than a year, or you have any kind of long-term vision, just import your cars when you first come on your first permit. The artist that I know that did that had the easiest time transitioning from worker to permanent resident to citizen and not have to deal with importing their vehicles later. The second thing you want to do is make sure you establish credit on your very first day or 2 here. So as soon as you get here, you want to go to a bank, you want to establish a bank account, you want to get a credit card. Now, you'll be told, and I've heard this a lot, that when people come across with their permit, they can't get unsecured credit cards. They can only get secured credit cards, which means you put like $200 in the bank and you can start using a card against the $200. It's a crappy way to build your credit, but you can at least build your credit for the first year, and then you can start getting unsecured credit. But let me tell you what I did. I got a $1,000 unsecured credit card the very first week I was here. And what I did is I went to the very bank branch that my studio, Image Engine, was using. It was a TD bank, and I went there and specifically said, hey, I'm coming here because you're the branch for the company that's now employing me. And I said, what can you do for me? And they were able to give me $1,000 unsecured credit. It turns out, if it's your very first work permit, there's a certain amount of credit risk where you actually can slip through and get unsecured credit. Now, the reason I bring this up is here I am 8 years later, and I'm looking, can we buy a house and do other things up here? And we've now established 8 years of really good credit and have a great credit score. Keep in mind, your American credit score means almost nothing up here. We lucked out. Our very first landlord had access to American credit reporting systems, so he could run our American credit report on our very first rental here. But most people up here do not have access to the American credit report system, and so your credit report is going to be empty when you come up here and try to rent your first place. So again, establishing credit when you first come up here is something you really, really want to do from day one. Number 3, if you at all think that you are going to be here longer than a year or two and you want to look at permanent residency, start reading about it and getting the steps taken care of early. Like I said, fingerprinting takes a while. You want to know what the costs are going to be in advance. You want to know what the timelines look like so that you can be prepared. So as soon as you hit those dates, you can apply. A lot of things can change. Pandemics can happen. Conservative government, when it took over, it actually pushed out those dates, making it harder to become an immigrant. And then when the liberals took back over, they changed the law back. So when I first got here, there was actually a much longer window for me to become a citizen. And then after the liberals took over, they changed it back. The laws can move fast in Canada. There is no gridlock, and whatever party wins generally makes the changes they want to make right away. So you kind of want to stay on the ball. I would recommend that a year after you've been here, start looking at permanent residency. So over that next year, you start getting all the steps and paperwork in place. You know, especially if you've traveled. If you have traveled to multiple countries, you really want to get started early, man. Luckily, Johanna and I didn't do a lot of traveling outside of the country in our lives. So as a result, we have a pretty short list, but every place you traveled needs to be accounted for, what days you traveled. Any country that you've lived in for more than 6 months, you're going to need to get your criminal record from that bureau. So for me, it was fingerprints from the FBI, but I know other folks who've had to struggle getting it from India and Mexico. And I know one guy who just took one day out of his vacation to India just to get his record because he knew that trying to get it remotely via mail was going to be too hard. So keep in mind, you want to plan in advance. So make sure you stay ahead of the ball, and I'm going to show the timeline in just a moment for becoming a permanent resident or a citizen here in Canada. And here they are. Generally, it's 730 days within 5 years to become a permanent resident. And again, if you're gone for a year and you come back, it's a cumulative number. To get citizenship, you have to be here for 3 years within a 5-year period. And the PR card itself is got a 5-year extension. So for a lot of people, getting your citizenship in the first 5 years of your PR is really the best way to go. And it's why I keep saying, start early. As soon as you finish your PR, start thinking about your citizenship and start tracking every border crossing you do, because you're going to have to report that in a log as part of your application for all those steps. And finally, the costs. So what does it cost for your work permit if you're being brought up here under a company? It should cost you nothing. There is, in fact, like a $75 charge or something you get charged at the border to get your work permit handed to you. But every company I know just pays you that as soon as you show up at the door. You expense that and they give you the money back. So it should cost you nothing functionally to get a work permit to come in here. Now, to get a permanent residency, it's going to cost you a little over $600 Canadian. It's like $500 something, but you have to pay for fingerprints. You've got to go get photos from the passport photo office. So there ends up being these little costs on the side. For citizenship, it's a little more expensive. It's $700 plus. And again, that's including some of the extra fees of getting photos and such. But you should bear in mind that's per person. So each person has to pay that. And you have to pay that when you apply. And then you pay a little bit at the end for the final step of getting your passport, basically. But yeah, those are the costs. I will say, to apply for permanent residency, a lot of people will get a permanent residency expert, basically a consultant to help them make sure they do it right. Some people will actually get a permanent residency lawyer, and it's a lawyer who specializes in this. Johanna being a production manager, myself being a project manager and a technology manager, we felt we had enough of the skills and wherewithal to tackle the process ourselves. However, it was burdensome. So I would say, if you're an artist or someone who's a little bit more art-minded and a little less structured or structural in the way they deal with paperwork and bureaucracies, maybe getting a consultant's not a bad idea, or a lawyer. But again, after meeting with a consultant, we felt it wasn't quite worth the money. So there it is. That's how I came here. It's an awesome experience coming up here. I got to say, crossing the border the first time and coming up here was one of the most stressful events of my life. It borders on probably the day I got married and hopefully the day I buy a house in the future. It's one of those days that you remember forever. You know, I got to say, whether it's the Canadian border guards or whether it's the Service Canada folks who helped us with our citizenship, everyone who we dealt with, right down to the very first border guard we met that very first stressful day, has been really, really helpful and professional and polite. And we've had a really great experience crossing the border here. So if you're a little nervous about that, which we were, don't worry about it too much. I'm nervous every time I cross the border because I'm always thinking there's something I didn't think of. But if you're not a little nervous, well, then that's suspicious. So there you go. So that's it. Take care, everybody. If you have any questions about getting into the country, please put it below. I want to thank everyone who stayed to the end. It's the folks that watch my videos all the way to the end, the folks like you, the watchers and subscribers who really keep me going doing all this work. So thanks a lot.